Good afternoon, everyone. We are glad to have you with us. Just a few housekeeping things first. This event is being recorded and live streamed to our School of Education YouTube channel. As an attendee, you will be muted and your video will be disabled. Change your view to speaker view. Please use the question answer box if you have questions to submit those, and we will address those at the end. And I would like to also give a special thanks to Kelly Bloom, who is our events coordinator in our dean's office. She has spearheaded and organizing this whole thing for us on the technical side. So if you have any technical issues, please use the chat function to Kelly Bloom. Welcome again. My name is Derek Williams, and I am the program director of UVA School Counseling Program. It's a privilege to be able to work here, mainly because I'm able to work with a wonderful group of faculty. Dr. Blair Chalawa, Dr. Amanda Flora, Dr. Paul Harris, Dr. Joseph Williams, Dr. Julia Taylor, and Dean Antoinette Thomas. Thank you for making my job so enjoyable and a lot of times pretty seamless and easy. So thank you for all that you do for us. If you've ever wondered about the role of a school counselor in addressing issues of race and how it impacts schools and policies, students and families within public schools, then you are in the right place. I'd like to welcome Dr. Cheryl Holcombe McCoy, Dean of the School of Education at American University. Thank you for taking time to be with us. Thank you for gracing us with your presence again to share your knowledge and your inspiration. I also like to welcome our distinguished panel, Dr. Carol Aiva, Dr. Renee Mays, Dr. Anita Young, and Dr. Tracy Jackson. Thank you for joining us and helping us to hold an important conversation and our call to action in anti-racist school counseling. Now we have over 750 people joining us, some via Zoom and then some via our YouTube channel viewing, school counselors, administrators, other school personnel, our current students and our alumni, welcome. It's great to have you in this space with us. And none of us would be here without the help and support of our school, our department, Dr. Scott Guest, Vicki Dahl, and Felicia Dahl and Vicki Thomas. And especially, I would like to acknowledge my colleague, my friend, Dr. Paul Harris, who in 2012 coordinated our first yearly series of a school counseling summit. And in each year since, he has led the efforts in providing educators and students with the professional development opportunity that directly impacts their work. Thank you, Dr. Harris. And now I will turn this program over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. I'm Paul Harris, as has been mentioned, and my task here is to introduce Dr. Holcombe McCoy, so I'm going to get right to that. Again, welcome to all of you. Hope you'll engage us in the chat, as Derek talked about, with reactions, questions, appreciations, experiences. And if you're on Twitter, we'll be using the hashtag #AntiracistSC, #AntiracistSC. Dr. Cheryl Holcombe McCoy, you know, Dr. Williams talked about our first holding this summit in 2012, and wouldn't you know, Dr. Holcombe McCoy was the one who opened up for us then, and I think it's just quite fitting these years later to come back around now, having spearheaded so many other things since then, not the least of which has been an anti-racist collective, which we'll hear a little bit more about today, and to have her back to spearhead our keynote today in this conversation. So Dr. Cheryl Holcombe McCoy is currently in her 5th year as Dean of the School of Education at American University. Previous to this role, she served as Vice Provost for Faculty Affairs, Central Administration, and Vice Dean of Academic Affairs in the School of Education at Johns Hopkins University. Previous to her time at Johns Hopkins, she was an Associate Professor at the University of Maryland, College Park, and Director of the School Counseling Program at Brooklyn College of the City University of New York. She is also a former elementary school counselor and kindergarten teacher. Dean Holcombe McCoy is the founder of American University's Summer Institute on Education, Equity, and Justice, and the AU Teacher Pipeline Project, a partnership with the District of Columbia Public Schools and Friendship Charter Schools. This year, she is collaborating with AU colleagues to create an anti-racist curriculum for teachers in training, and with her School of Education colleagues, she launched an anti-racist school leadership graduate certificate program this fall. Dean Holcombe-McCoy is an American Counseling Association Fellow for her significant contributions in counseling research, scientific achievement, and from 2014 to 2016, she was a consultant to Michelle Obama's Reach Higher initiative. Would you help me and join me rather in welcoming Dr. Cheryl Holcombe-McCoy? Dr. Holcombe-McCoy, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, we can.
Okay. All right, am I all set on the screen? Yes?
Well, we are getting there. We see you and are waiting for your presentation screen.
Okay.
You know, I forgot to add, Dr. Holcombe-McCoy, I referenced her time at the University of Maryland, and it was at that time in my doctoral program that I actually had a chance to get to know her. And I've learned over time to appreciate those who can both support but challenge you. And Dr. Holcombe-McCoy has been that for me and so many others. I've learned to keep those folks close, and kept Dr. Holcombe-McCoy close for being one to challenge and support and make me and so many other professionals better.
Look, that's so nice of you. That's so nice of you, Paul, to say that. But I think part of, you know, the journey, my career journey has been the opportunity to just interact with such wonderful colleagues, professionals, and students. And Paul, you are one of those students that I had at the University of Maryland that I really learned so much from. So thank you so much for that. I'm just so happy to be here again. And I'm going to ask one more time, technology is not my thing. Can you see me and see the presentation? Yes?
We can see you, but not your presentation yet.
Still not the presentation yet. Okay, hold on. Sorry about the tech difficulties. What about now?
Not yet.
Okay, hold on, hold on. Okay, this might do it.
And now we are ready to go.
Yes. All right. Just like a school counselor, you always keep trying until you get it right. And here we are. So thank you, Paul, once again. And thank you, everyone out there for your patience. I want to just say that, you know, this is a really great, wonderful opportunity for me, because coming to the School Counseling Summit at UVA is like coming back home. I don't know if Paul didn't mention this in the introduction, but I am a graduate, two-time graduate of University of Virginia, and finished my master's degree in counseling in the former Curry School of Education. And so it brings me great joy to come back to share with you some of the things that I'm thinking about in school counseling, particularly around anti-racist school counseling. I also want to applaud the University of Virginia for changing the name of its school to better reflect inclusive excellence, and as looking forward as a way to signal that the school, as well as the university, is really thinking about issues around diversity, inclusion, and equity. So I applaud the University of Virginia School of Education for that. I also want to take some time today, in getting ready for this presentation. It came over me that, these conversations around issues of diversity, issues around multicultural counseling, and school counseling, I really could never have formulated some of these ideas without collaborating with a very, very dear colleague who we lost this year, Dr. Vivian Lee, who was also a graduate of the School of Education at the University of Virginia. And actually, I met her on campus there in Charlottesville. And so I would like to dedicate this presentation today to her, Dr. Vivian Lee, who was a real equity warrior in every sense of the word, and just a school counseling advocate and true professional at Johns Hopkins when she passed. So this is dedicated to Vivian. The title of my presentation today is From Social Justice to Anti-Racism, a New Era in School Counseling. And, today I wanted to really sort of cue it up for this wonderful panel that you will be listening to later on, as they give their sort of opinions and thoughts around where are we going when we talk about anti-racist school counseling, and how are we going to get there? And I think it helps for us to really think about where we've been. So I want to start today by looking at the evolution of counseling and issues of race, because this will sort of set the groundwork for our understanding around anti-racist school counseling. I don't know if many of you're not as old as I am, but in the 60s and 70s, and when I first entered into the field of counseling, school counseling in the mid 80s, there was a lot of talk around Black psychology, and even in the counselor education world, there was a borrowing of some of the literature from Black psychology. Now, Black psychology evolved in the 60s and 70s as a response to what the disconnect between the understanding of traditional counseling theories and the Black experience, or the psychology of being Black, if you will, in the United States. And during that time, this was also a rebellion around what we call scientific racism, the issues around research methods that were not particularly inclusive of the Black experience. And so those scholars and psychologists primarily that came out of this period, like Asa Hilliard, Wade Nobles, and Faye Belgrave, I think she's still at Virginia Commonwealth University, really did, make the ground fertile for our understanding of issues of race and racism in this country, and really did delve into the Black experience. And so that is sort of how I like to think of where we started in this journey around anti-racism. The next piece of literature, or this movement, we started talking about cross-cultural counseling and psychology, I would say around in the 80s. And when I was there at the University of Virginia, Cortland Lee was one of my professors there. And he started talking about cross-cultural counseling. And really, cross-cultural counseling is really, this was a movement when we first started to think about that the client and the counselor actually come from different cultures. And so there could be possibly this cultural clash. The importance of culture in the counseling process really became the pinnacle of cross-counseling psychology research, and looking at how cultures come together within the counseling process. Daryl Wing Su and some of the really great work that he did. Clement von Tress out of GW wrote extensively about the cross-cultural experience in counseling. And during this time, race was a part of the conversation, but culture per se was really the focal point of the research and the counseling theory. I talked about Cortland Lee. So as time grew and from the 80s into the 90s, we started to broaden this conversation around counseling, and we named it multicultural counseling to really expand the view, if you will, of the many different social identities and cultures that people possess. So it was not necessarily about one culture or two cultures, the culture of these two people in the counseling process. It became a conversation about the multiple social identities and cultures that people ascribe to. And that became the multicultural movement in counseling. We think of Cortland Lee, Michael D'Andrea, and so many more. In each of these categories, if you will, there's so many more. There are lots of scholars, but I just pulled out some of the scholars that you might have some recognition with. So multicultural counseling became a movement, and some people even called it the fourth movement or in counseling, this issue around cross-culturalness and multicultural counseling. My research around the multicultural competence came out of this period of the mid-90s and into the 2000s. And some of you might be even familiar with some of the work that I have done, the research that I've done around the assessment of one's multicultural competence. And this came out of the standards in which ACA and APA created first cross-cultural counseling competency standards, and then it became multicultural counseling standards. And then recently, probably around in the 2000s, we started to talk about social justice counseling, in which there was more of an emphasis on human rights and looking at the broad systems of oppression. And social justice, when you think about justice, you think about doing what's right and really focusing on those marginalized populations and people who have traditionally have been or historically have been marginalized. Social justice counseling also had a very wide view. Race and issues of race was included, but it was not the primary source of oppression. It could be oppression due to one's sexual orientation. It could be one's, oppression due to one's gender or gender identity. It could be according to one's economic status. And so social justice was really looking at those systems of oppression across many different groups. And that was the focus of social justice. And we tend to think of advocacy, the work around advocacy coming out of this era of talking about social justice counseling, that counselors can act not only as counselors within a counseling session, but also advocates for systemic change. So where are we now? Now we're talking about anti-racist counseling. And as I was preparing my notes, I was thinking, this is more like all of these kinds of titles that we've given, the literature and these eras, if you will, are all interconnected. It really isn't linear. They're all related to one another. And I think in our conversation around anti-racist counseling that really came out of this summer as we witnessed the murder of George Floyd, and we read about Breonna Taylor, and we really reckoning with the racial and, just the racial injustices in this country, we are starting to come back to this notion of our history around race, particularly anti-Black racism in this country. And it takes us back to the Black psychologists who were talking about that in the 60s and 70s. So we've evolved and we're coming back full circle. That doesn't say that anti-racist school counseling is not inclusive of multicultural counseling or cross-cultural counseling or social justice counseling, but anti-racist counseling surely does cover all of these areas or these periods of, of, of our literature in which we're looking at issues of counseling that is inclusive of different groups of people. So I would argue that anti-racist counseling is the foundation, that to be a great social justice school counselor, we must understand how to be an anti-racist. To be to be multiculturally competent, we have to understand Black psychology. We have to understand what it takes to be in a cross-cultural counseling relationship. We must understand social justice and human rights. That is all inclusive. So there's not one without the other. These are all very important as we talk about our work in school counseling. So most of you, or you might know, that back in 2007, I wrote this book where it was just a labor of love. It was like almost like a brain dump. I just put it on paper, the school counseling to close the achievement gap. I didn't call it anti-racism then, but I was thinking about issues of race and racism in schools and in systems, how we have so many racist ideas and policies and procedures in our work that play out in schools. At the time, though, I wrote about this in a way in which to talk about issues of how achievement gaps are brought about by issues of racist ideas and racism in schools. I would, if I were to write this book again, which I hope to write another edition soon, I will not use the terminology achievement gap, because we think of one's achievement as being in a very deficit way. I would say it's school counseling to open opportunity rather than, thinking about the achievement gap between students, because I do believe that we don't have an achievement gap, we have an opportunity gap. In this book, which I still ascribe to, I call it a social justice-based view of school counseling, in which all of these, it's the 6 C's, you see them all on the screen now, are all interconnected. And these are the roles in which school counselors work. These are the things that we do, the real practice of school counseling. And if we think of each piece here with a social justice lens, we also are thinking from a racial, we're really thinking about the racist or racial types of implications. For instance, in our counseling and intervention planning, we should be thinking about issues of race and racism, how it plays out in the counseling process, broaching race and racism with our students, with the students that we're working with, the parents, because it is a real issue. So it is embedded in that counseling and intervention planning, collecting and using data to illustrate racialized outcomes. When we're talking about student services, we should be thinking about how race plays a part in how we determine who gets support and who does not get support. When we think about consultation, we can't have race-blind consultation. Race is playing a part in the consultation process with parents and with teachers all the time. And we have to be aware of that in order to be an anti-racist school counselor, to be a socially just school counselor. And then connecting schools and communities. How can we connect schools and communities without talking about the issues in the community that stem from racist ideas, racist policies, and our racial history? There's no way we can do that without talking about race. And then challenging bias. When I wrote that section on challenging bias, I was really talking about challenging racism, challenging all of the isms that we find playing out in our schools. So the social justice-based school counseling framework that I developed in 2007 does have still, I believe, a basis in what I call an anti-racist school counseling model. So anti-racist school counseling, as Paul mentioned, a lot of school counselor educators, school counseling professionals have come together in a collective, and we meet and we talk about, well, really, what is anti-racist school counseling? If I had to define it, how is it different from, social justice-based counseling? Like I said, they're all interconnected, but what makes an anti-racist, right? And so I thought I would pull from, he's become, well-known, Jason Reynolds has become well-known. He's an award-winning author, and he summed it up. And here's a minute video that I want you to, I think he gives a great analogy for what is anti-racism and how is it different from just being not racist. Take a listen.
I would say on a very basic level, it's just about passive and active language, right? To say one is not racist doesn't actually connote any action. I think what's even more analogous to think about, if you think about, let's pick baseball, right? You take baseball, to be not racist is going for a bunt. You hold the bat out, the ball, you hope the ball hits the bat. You're not expecting to hit the ball hard. You just want to get the ball to connect with the bat so that you can do the best you can to attempt to make the play. To be anti-racist is to swing the bat as hard as you can and go for the home run, right? To put in the extra effort to shoot for the stars and to actually swing that bat, right? To risk the strike, right? But you swing the bat as hard as you can every single time, right? Because you understand that that's the way you game, that's the way you change things. And I think bunts still count as a hit, but is it an actual swing? No. And I think people who say they're not racist, they're just going for the hit. I just want to make sure that I got a hit on my record. As long as I say I'm not racist, I feel like I can absolve myself of any shame and guilt without actually having to do any work or sacrifice anything. But we all know that love doesn't come without sacrifice or risk. Anti-racist is connected to love.
So I totally agree with Jason on this, that we don't want to bunt anymore. We want to hit the ball out the park, that it's not good enough for us as school counselors, and in the pivotal position that we have in schools. I mean, counselors have, I always said, a powerful perch in which to do their work. We see everything. We know the policies, we know the people, we know the community. So what better people within a school than to do this work around anti-racism than school counselors? So if we just bunt, as Jason puts it, we're not doing the hard work. We're not making this happen for Black and Brown children to have an opportunity. And so the Anti-Racist Foundation is us really taking this long shot and hitting it as hard as we can so that our students will have the opportunities to be successful. And so this notion of anti-racist school counseling really does require us to recognize and affirm, first of all, the wholeness and the humanness of students, families, and their communities. Anti-racism in school counseling requires us not to be passive, to not, we can't just sit back and say nothing. We have to act. We have to act and stand up when we see things that are happening that's working against Black and Brown children, Indigenous children, those who are marginalized in our society. It is a chance for us to address and dismantle racist policies, ideologies, and practices in our schools. And so anti-racism, again, is about the humanness. This is what we do as school counselors. We're all about humanity. We're all about the fairness, the equity, the love. That's what's part of this work. But to be an anti-racist school counselor, I believe, and I propose today, that we have to commit to developing new practices and policies through our own self-awareness. I call it our self-interrogation. We have to continue to ask ourselves and reflect on our own blind spots, our own racist ideologies, our own racist beliefs, and then we act to correct what's happening in our schools, these practices in our schools. And I call it, we have to move away, decentering whiteness in our schools, decentering the practices that have always been in place that have worked against the growth and development and the progress of Black and Brown students. That's the core of anti-racist school counseling, which is the core to everything else that we're doing. It's the foundation for the social justice work, for the multicultural work, for all of that work that we have been ascribing to for many years. Anti-racist school counseling takes us to the very core of what happens in our schools. So very quickly, because I know I'm running out of time, I propose this is where we need to look, school counselors. These systems that have traditionally failed students, discipline policies, we need to take a hard look. How do we identify the gifted and talented? Who's in those honors courses, the college prep groupings? This is where our racist ideologies sit. They sit within these policies in schools. We are seeing a resegregation of schools, zoning policies. That's where racist policies sit. That's where we have to dismantle the dissemination of college and career information, how we engage with parents, their grading systems, our standardized tests, and even the hiring of school counselors and other educators in schools. We are seeing the continued whiteness of our profession. We are lacking in diversity even within our own ranks. This is where we should be focusing our work and our practice. And what do we do best? And this is where school counselors really know how to do this work around anti-racism. It's with our empathy, it's our intentionality, it's our courage. To be an anti-racist, we have to be courageous. We have to be intentional in our practice. We have to show humanness and humanity for those who we don't possibly understand, but we must try to understand and show the empathy for those who are suffering because of these policies in place. We're looking at equality and equity, and we are allies and co-conspirators. You know, Bettina Love talks about the fact that it's not good enough to be an ally anymore, because allies can just say, yeah, I'm for you, that's great. But co-conspirators actually step in and they help and they take part of the hit as well. We want more school counselors who are co-conspirators in this quest for anti-racism and for equal justice for all. And most importantly, there's a need for love and joy. There's nothing as hard as this work, but it's the joy that we must celebrate, the accomplishments that we make, and still find joy in each other. So I want to leave you today, and I know the panel is about to get started, and I can't wait to hear what they talk about. But I just want to say that, you know, I used to tell students that you cannot acknowledge that which you deny or choose not to see. So the first step in being an anti-racist school counselor is to break through the denial, to say this is what it is. And then the question becomes, what will you do? And I want to leave you with that question. What will you do? Some will do more than others. Some will do just a small thing, but it's a matter of saying, yes, this is an issue. I acknowledge it, and now I can do my part. And so I look forward to hearing all about the wonderful things that you're going to do to ensure the success and the growth and development of all students. And I'll end there. Thank you again for having me today, and I look forward to hearing from the panel. Thank you.
Dr. Holcombe McCoy, thank you. I'm learning after having heard such great content and inspired knowledge and expertise, to just say thank you. And so I'll say that, thank you. And even more so, to say thank you with continued action in following your lead. If you, like me, have some comments and praise and questions for Dr. Holcombe McCoy, please feel free to drop them in the chat right now. One of my graduate students, UVA, Ellie Wingert, will be organizing those questions. We'll do the best that we can on the back end to answer as many as we can. So please drop again the praise you have for the words that were shared, as well as questions that you might want her to follow up on. And as you do that, I want to introduce, as Dr. Holcombe McCoy referenced, a panel of speakers who will continue to speak on and to anti-racism in some of the areas that Dr. Holcombe-McCoy referenced in her keynote presentation. And so I'll introduce all of the panel and then allow them to speak in that order for about 5 to 7 minutes. And similarly, please drop questions in the chat as we all share. And again, Ellie will organize them and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible during our Q&A on the back end. First, we'll have Dr. Renee Mays. Dr. Renee Mays is an associate professor in the Department of Disability and Psychoeducational Studies at the University of Arizona. She's a licensed school counselor and national certified counselor with experience in K-12 schools, along with specialized educational settings. Informed by critical race theory, critical race feminism, discrit, and bioecological systems theories, her research agenda centers around the academic success and college readiness for gifted Black students with disabilities and Black girls. Following Renee, we'll have Dr. Kara Aiva. Dr. Kara Aiva is currently an associate professor in the Counseling and Educational Settings program at Rowan University. And in addition to her current position in counselor education, her educational career spans over 20 years as a former Spanish teacher and a professional school counselor. Kara's areas of research interest include promoting equity and wellness in education for children and adolescents of marginalized populations in the areas of college and career readiness, social emotional development, and group counseling. I'll be honored to share a little bit after her. I'm an associate professor in the counselor ed program at UVA, a former high school counselor, and my research agenda includes promoting the college and career readiness of underrepresented populations with emphasis on Black male student athletes and the role of school counselors in that process. After me, Dr. Anita Young will share, and she is an associate professor in the School of Education at Johns Hopkins University. Prior to joining the faculty at Johns Hopkins University, she served as school counseling district supervisor and a school-based administrator for Fairfax County Public School District in Virginia. She's well published and has experience, again, as a school counselor and a middle school teacher. Dr. Young has a two-strand research agenda that focuses on closing achievement and opportunity gaps to increase post-secondary educational access for K-12 students, especially in urban school settings, and building leadership capacity for school counselors. And closing us out today will be Dr. Tracy Jackson, who currently serves as the supervisor of school counseling services for the Loudoun County Public Schools. Dr. Jackson has been a school counselor since 1997 and has spent the last 13 years as a central office school counseling administrator. She has also held similar positions for Syracuse City School District and Virginia Beach City Public Schools. She also serves as an adjunct instructor and has done so for several years at several university programs. And so with that, Dr. Renee Mays, I will let you take it from here.
Thanks, Dr. Harris. Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be with you all and truly honored to be among this rock star panel and the Dr. Cheryl Holcombe-McCoy. I got to hang out with her for a little bit at University of Maryland. And quite frankly, she's the reason why I went. So it's lovely to be here. In the few minutes that I have, I wanted to talk a little bit more about gifted education and our role in that, particularly for school counselors and how we might be collaborative. And I want to touch on maybe an aspect of gifted ed that we don't think about, which is the intersection of giftedness and disability. So first, as we think about gifted education, something that we might notice across any district that we're in is that gifted ed is overwhelmingly white, with some diversity of our Asian brothers, sisters, and friends, right? And so that's wonderful. I'm glad that there are students being identified for gifted education. But as we think about anti-racist work, we have to ask ourselves, what about Black and Brown children? So something that tends to happen as a part of the gifted identification process is that one, it starts with referral. So it starts with time in the classroom, and a teacher might see student behaviors or inclinations and say, I wonder if this kiddo is gifted. And so they make that referral to the identification team for gifted ed. And then that kind of jumpstarts the process. But a challenge within that is that often Black and brown students their behaviors aren't seen as gifted. So you might have that Black or brown child who's in the classroom and just excited, can't sit still, is moving about, constantly talking. And that's seen as a disruption and not as strength, not as an indication of brilliance. And so that then jumps into this cycle of Black and brown children, I think, being pushed out of educational spaces rather than engaged for the brilliance that they possess. So as we think more about gifted education, so we have this disproportionality that exists in terms of Black and brown students being under-identified. And then you also, for folks, once they get identified, it doesn't actually mean that everything's peaches and cream. It often isn't. So there are often reports of discrimination or bias or just not feeling welcome in that space, right? Where we're all supposed to be these exceptional learners, but we're not all treated as such. In fact, as Dr. Holcombe McCoy said, gifted ed is seen as a white space often, and often treated as property, right? And that you come into this white space and either you acquiesce or you get out because you weren't supposed to be here in the first place. Something happened in the system. Another aspect of anti-racist work is this thing called intersectionality. And intersectionality means that we can have, or we can possess, these multiple identities that then have intersecting planes of oppression. And so as a part of that, I want to draw attention to this thing called twice exceptionality, particularly for Black and brown students. So you might be identified, it's more likely for Black and brown students to be identified as needing special education services first, regardless of if that is the appropriate or right label or thing to happen. But once that happens, they're often taken out of the running for gifted education. And so we have to, I think, be really mindful of the ways that schools kind of perpetuate this idea of Black inferiority or Black and brown inferiority, and that to be smart is to be something that is not Black or brown. So we I think have to be really mindful of that. So as we're thinking about anti-racist approaches, we certainly, as Dr. Holcombe McCoy said, we need to interrogate ourselves. How do we understand what giftedness is? Who gets to be gifted? What does it look like? And also for us as school counselors, how do we contribute to that? So we're often at the table when these decisions are made, both for special education and also for gifted education. Are we a rubber stamp? Are we passing things along? Or are we interrupting that process and saying, no, I don't think that we have this right, or we're missing something? Another piece that we should come back to always is, what is the data? What is the data telling us? So as we look at our data for gifted education, who's in there? And how is our school kind of doing or adding itself to a feedback loop of who gets to be gifted and who gets to be served, right? That, I think, invites a conversation, right? How do we as a school value giftedness, and who gets to be gifted? And how are our policies and practices reinforcing that? That, I think, invites an opportunity to interrogate those policies, interrogate those practices. So I believe fully that our gifted education and special education should represent our student population, right? So we shouldn't see disproportionality. It should be pretty equal, right? Not in terms of the same number of students in this or that, but rather it should be in proportion with our student population. There are some really cool, I think, helpful models to think about not only gifted ed, the gifted education, not only a process of how we implement that education, which tends to kind of be whitewashed, but also in the identification process. And so I don't have quite enough time to go in deeply into it, but I want to mention it. And it's the gifted program advocacy model. And so that it's a four-phase process model that allows us to address underrepresentation and also move towards better practices, both in identification, but also in implementation, right? So gifted ed shouldn't be a thing that is owned by whiteness, but as Dr. Holcombe McCoy said, we need to decenter whiteness. And so this, I think, is a framework that can help us do that. So I know that was a lot in a little bit of time, but I'm looking forward to more conversation about gifted out or about exceptionality. And I think that it's time to pass this on to Dr. Aiva.
Yes, and thank you, Renee. I think I'm excited to be here with everyone in this space. And I think Dr. Holcombe McCoy and Dr. Mays have set this up brilliantly for what I'm about to discuss. And as we're talking about all of these places and spaces of decentering whiteness in schools, we really need to talk about what happens in the classroom that really starts this. And it starts really early, particularly in pre-K and elementary schools. And when I think about anti-racist school counseling, there are some changes to how we've typically been delivering what we're doing. We still want to holistically work with our students from a strength-based perspective and a developmental model to really plan, right, in successful social emotional learning academically and in career planning and post-secondary. But the other piece of that is really about student voice and to really have them understand the process by which they're also being educated so they too one day could be that voice, but then also the advocate for those who can't yet speak for themselves. And so what happens in a classroom is we all know, right, that education is predominantly white, as has already been previously mentioned. And teachers, just like us as counselors, fall somewhere along this continuum that, because I don't have a lot of time, we'll go into. But basically, if we're not decentering whiteness, then we're also being complacent. And complacency really does harm our kids. And so what happens in schools is our teachers have certain practices that start in the classroom that truly have a major impact and cause what I'll call generational educational trauma for our students, and particularly for our Black and Brown students. And with that being said, one of the first ones is labeling. And I say this because in this new era of working in our MTSS model, I guess, in a tier one, and typically thinking about working with collaboration and consultation with teachers, we really need to start examining their practices that are racist practices in classrooms that ultimately affect our students. And labeling is one of them. I'm sure most of you heard in your grad school programs to stay out of the lunchroom. And realistically, why? Because that's where bad talking happened, right? And so we do have teachers who traditionally will label students, will talk about them like that with other students, which then, right, obviously hurt students in some sort of way. It's also been shown through research that expectations of our Black and Brown students tend to be low, both from an academic standpoint and a social emotional learning kind of standpoint. And the question to that is, who gets to choose, right, what's appropriate as far as people being able to express themselves, both in verbally and in writing? Who gets to be angry? Who gets to be celebrated, right? These are questions to kind of take a look at. The other is classroom policies. And one of the things I would say is that subconsciously, and neuroscience tells us this, that our students sitting in a classroom tend to mirror what their teachers' actions are, right? So those going into teaching are also going to mirror those actions, but those who are white peers sitting in that classroom are also going to pick that up subconsciously. And so teachers sometimes use classroom policies. Dr. Holcombe McCoy talked about school policies and discipline policies, but classroom policies work in the same way, whereas teachers have power and control in that room and sometimes use it, right? And here are things to ask ourselves. Who's able to go to the bathroom, right? Who has to wait? How do students get grouped? Are students who are perceived to be lower picked and put into lower groups? Same thing with grading and assessments, right? Who's allowed to make them up? Who is allowed to miss? And who do they call? When do they call home and why do they call home? And the other thing we know, and school counselors were not immune to this, our colleague, Dr. Carrie Dimmitt, just shared with us her research. We know that grading already has an implicit bias in it and it is very subjective and it tends to impact our Black and Brown students. But simultaneously, we as school counselors also have our own implicit bias. And she showed this through what Dr. Renee Mays was talking about, our recommendations to high-level courses, right? Who has access, how are they getting there, and how are we disrupting that loop, as Dr. Mays just said. Simultaneously, also referrals, right? We tend to only see referrals for behavior and discipline. When we talk about education to prison pipeline, it didn't just start in a policy, it also started in a classroom with a teacher and how they viewed students. The other thing, in another way that teachers practice racism is through their curriculum and pedagogy, not having a representative aspect of culturally sustaining pedagogy. and in their books and in their curriculum, but simultaneously we're still teaching, right, the inaccuracies as far as history is concerned. And then the other aspect is how we're communicating with students. We've seen from an implicit bias standpoint that teachers tend to see students, and particularly Black and brown students, from a deficit model. And so that communication happens to be that way. And so every time someone is redirected or yelled at, right, they're not spoken with praise or that they feel welcome or that they're valued. So as students internalize these things, we're left to, they're going to express that in multiple different ways. And one of those is disengaging, right? Can you imagine going to school every day for your life because it was told, hey, this is what's going to make you feel better, and then be subjected to what we'll call some form of trauma on a daily basis. And so for school counselors, what that means for you is this: we have multiple ethical codes, some by which are being culturally competent, being non-discriminatory, staying up to date, and really creating and removing barriers for systemic change. And one of the things that we're asking you to do is just really start taking a look at what that looks like in specific classrooms. I know all of you in here have certain teachers that you've heard about who don't do well with the students, or you would keep certain students away from their classroom as a result because it wouldn't be a good fix. And now we're asking you to interrogate that a little more and to be able to do something with that. So what that means is that you're also going to have to build relationships over a period of time with all of your teachers in your building, and not that you don't, but in a different way, so that you are then able to consult with them as things arise. And so that means, that means that you might actually have to work with them to see your students' strengths, because you are that advocate. And you might also have to teach them both individually and whole school on how to use strength-based communication and in redirection. And it might also helping them look inward, and you as well, as at your own implicit bias. And I should say this, we know this, but school counselors, we also have to be mindful of our own awareness. And so we really need to start asking ourselves, what messages are students getting from teachers, administration, and us? And how are they getting those messages? Because whatever that is what we need to start taking a look at and interrogating. And so the last thing I would add to this is we've always talked about systemic change in our field, and we've always talked about using data to do that. But that data we've always looked at tended to be from a deficit model. It didn't always include student voice. And so I'm asking you to start recognizing patterns. Who are those classrooms? Look at grades. We've always pulled grades about who's failing, and we pull up that D&F list. I can tell you I had a practicum student last year who started looking at all of those grades and realized the same teacher's failing students, and those students happened to be Black and brown students. And so she went to her supervisor, and her supervisor was like, no, this is just how he grades, no big deal. And so she went to administration, and come to find out, he truly just failed the students in this particular class because they were Black and brown. And it changed the game for all of those students. And so we're asking you to keep removing those barriers and opening up those opportunities for our students, but we need to start questioning, and that questioning level starts to begin in the classroom with teachers. And I think I'm moving on to you, Dr. Paul Harris.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Kara Eva. And gosh, in addition to all that's been shared, the question I want to address or speak to for the few minutes is just how might our implementation of anti-racist efforts include athletics, and particularly for Black males. In his book, $40 Million Slaves, which I'd recommend, William Roden writes, quote, "One of the most compelling themes in sports, one that the Black athlete would revisit in various problematic iterations over time, is the use of athletics as a way out." And this captures what, certainly in the 19th century, sports represented for African Americans. There was a gentleman, in fact, by the name of Tom Molinall that William Roden writes about, who he was born into slavery and literally fought his way to freedom after making his owner a substantial amount of money with his boxing talent. And many would argue that theme on some level persists today. There's this notion, if you will, that for Black males, sports still represents this perceived primary vehicle through which we can improve our station in life. Professor Joseph Cooper, in his book, From Exploitation Back to Empowerment, says more specifically that sports participation can be a mesmerizing prize for Black males during the late 19th century and even 20th century, as it was a means to achieve some resemblance of humanity and citizenship. Excelling in sport often provided access to previously denied privileges, such as travel, improved lodging conditions, food accommodations, etc. But as Professor Cooper and other researchers readily note, the impetus for Black male participation was a result of inequitable interest convergence, where whites' economic interest and entertainment benefits superseded that of the personal well-being, professional gains, collective racial uplift, and empowerment of Blacks. And so if we as educators, as has been said, assume this not racist posture, and Ibram Kendi talks about this in his work as well, as opposed to an anti-racist posture, we risk then perpetuating the very status quo that in rhetoric we are against. A paper I wrote a few years ago detailed the role of sports in the educational attainment process of Black males, and it looked very similar to that of their white counterparts in that it had a positive effect on educational outcomes, but that positive effect was only noted at the junior varsity level in high school. And as it went up to varsity, we saw a decrease. And through Sean Harper's work out of the University of Southern California, we know that the disparity in educational outcomes at the college level are even more stark as it relates to Black male student athletes and their non-Black student athlete counterparts and Black non-student athlete counterparts, if I can say that 3 times fast. So what do we do as school counselors, as educators more broadly, and in which I include coaches? And I just want to throw 5 things, maybe 4 if we have time for, before transitioning. 1, recognize that racism through athletics is not just in the hood. I worked as a high school counselor in the hood, if you will, and later in the suburbs. And the same high athletic identity that was cultivated in the hood, where my young kings were literally trying to help their parents make ends meet and saw athletics as a way to do that. Eventually, that same high athletic identity I saw in my young Black men in the suburbs who were living in $500,000 homes. That isn't to say that high athletic identity by itself is a problem. It is not. It is, however, when that athletic identity is somewhat exclusive in nature to the detriment of academic identity, which is what we see more disproportionately in Black male student athletes. 2, recognize that racism through sport is cultivated. It's cultivated. I love how Dr. Holcombe McCoy kind of referenced the opportunity gap and not the achievement gap. This is a cultivation of an issue that isn't inherent nor innate in these young Black men. I'm the youngest of 4 kids, to give a little bit of my own personal background. Grew up on Long Island. My parents grew up in Harlem. My dad enlisted in the military at 18. They traveled the world, and then they landed on Long Island some 20 years later, which is where I was born, and grew up far from rich, but definitely we were in a different position than my parents were in their childhood. My high school had about 90% matriculation rate to 2 or 4 year colleges. And yet I was so focused on my own athletic identity that had it not been for my parents setting a bar higher than that which was required for me to be eligible to play, I do not know where I would be. It was my senior year in high school, in fact, before I even realized that I was a Division V recruit, as I often say to my students. If you don't know college sports, there's only 3 divisions, and yet I was a D5 recruit. So systemic racism is no joke. I was getting all the messages at home about education. My 3 older siblings had gone off to college, and still, when I matriculated to the University of Virginia as an undergraduate non-student athlete, it took me a while to figure out who I was without the ball. How does that happen? Can you imagine for more elite athletes what that process is like? 3, create spaces that empower a multidimensional sense of self. And I want to give quickly 3 sort of sub-bullets to that point. It includes critical consciousness, creating spaces as school counselors, as educators, where we can talk about the reality of the racial integration of sports, that it wasn't a moral imperative. It was an economic and entertainment one. And still today, Black sport participation functions really within the norms of whiteness. In the early 1900s, it was said of Jack Johnson, the first Black boxing champion, that he had innate cerebral deficiencies. Fast forward to 2018, and we hear LeBron James is being told to do what? Shut up and dribble. critical consciousness, talk about it. Secondly, cultivate positive identity, create opportunities for Black athletes to be positively reinforced for more than just athletics. I was guilty myself as a counselor. Just naturally, I love sports. And so I'm going to ask, how was the game? How much did you score? Did you win? Genuinely. And yet I found myself, if not careful, reinforcing again the same status quo that we are wanting to push against. How much was I reinforcing their success in the classroom, helping them to highlight their strengths in athletics, and helping them see the translation to academics and career trajectories outside of sports? Creating spaces where geniuses like John Carlos and Harry Edwards and William Henry Lewis can be discussed, and how they recognize athletics was simply a platform for pursuing a much broader purpose than that of their triple-double or their 200-yard rushing game. Lastly, creating moments for social action. I run a Black male student athlete mentoring and group counseling program in Charlottesville. And a few years ago, we had the high school kids go to a nonprofit space in the projects here in Charlottesville, where middle school students are tutored, et cetera. And those high school students certainly had the attention of these young guys who were just looking up to their high school idols. But it did more than just for the middle school kids. These high school kids were then able to experience a sense of self-worth outside of the lines that many had really not experienced. Social action. A couple more thoughts. Fourthly, understanding that NCAA eligibility requirements and how they crosswalk or not to college and career readiness indicators. Just having an understanding of that. NCAA, I should say, has made incredible strides toward that end over the years, and that should be noted. And yet still the work of school counselors to work with coaches is absolutely critical for a holistic college choice process for our Black youth to be pursued. High school counselors, be in the room when recruiters come. Get with the athletic director and get on the agenda for that coaches meeting and talk about how your department, the counseling department that is, facilitates the college and career readiness for all students, and how you can work in tandem with athletics, particularly for those student athletes getting recruited, which starts so much younger these days. And maybe in our Q&A portion, if there's time, we can talk about some of the things to actually say in those moments with coaches. And the last thing I'll mention is using a strengths-based approach. Dr. Holcombe spoke to the anti-deficit paradigm. Incorporate everything I just shared through that framework. Just like the achievement gap isn't a failing on the part of racial minorities, but rather the underserving of those students in terms of that opportunity gap Dr. Holcombe referenced. So similarly is a high athletic identity to the detriment of their academic identity, not something innately sort of bent, if you will, with regard to Black male student athletes, but in terms of how sport is structured and delivered, and the socialization of Black males to be disproportionately drawn to a space that we know doesn't have room for them in terms of professional rankings and so forth. It's cultivated, it's reinforced. And so instead of figuring out how Black males have grit and resilience, which is a great area to study, not saying it is not, let's also though begin to deconstruct and disrupt the systems that make it necessary for grit to even be a topic to be discussed. I'll be quiet and now shift it over to Dr. Anita Young.
All right, good afternoon. Thank you so much, Dr. Harris. There is such excitement, enthusiasm within this panel today. And I concur with the sentiments of all of my colleagues on this panel. As a former school-based and district school counseling leader, I acknowledge the parasite of systemic racism in our educational system. You know, racism at any categorical identifier, such as institutional, personal racism, it isn't new. As a matter of fact, it's racism in some cases, maybe most cases, is really the undercurrent for the opportunity gaps that exist within our schools today. When we think about the only solution to that, to those racist ideologies and practices that exist within our schools, it is an anti-racist stance. So just allow me for just a few seconds to park here for a moment, because it's important for us to quantify that all school counselors, whether you're elementary, you're middle, or you're a high school counselor, that you can lead where you are within your current scope and practice to affect meaningful change for our Black and Brown students. However, when we think about school-based and district school counselor leaders, there are additional layers of leadership responsibilities that may encompass supervision, evaluation, or just expanded layers of professional development as well. So what does this mean when we think about school counselor leaders? It means that school counselor leaders must possess a racial awareness and accept a responsibility and accountability to dismantle the oppression and the racism that currently exists within your schools and your districts. So how should anti-school counseling leadership manifest itself? Especially when we believe that as educational leaders, we already have this fundamental commitment to equity and closing gaps. Well, it means that an anti-racist school counselor leader doesn't just have a commitment. There is an actionable integration of social justice and advocacy to move toward the direction of anti-racist leadership. It becomes a movement, an actionable movement. There should always be this constant discovery of kind of internal and external reflection and preparation. There has to be an acknowledgement of the power and the privilege that's bestowed to school and district school counseling leaders, whether it's real or perceived. There should be this continuous examination of what our racialized beliefs are. This process within itself can be challenging because we are socialized to really not communicate about race. And if we don't talk about it, the tendency is not to respond to it. But unfortunately, we know what happens. We know that these passive beliefs of unconscious biases about racism can drive school counselor leaders' decisions. And we know that decisions drive our actions, and that our actions as school counselor leaders translate into policies. So that burning task for school-based and district school counseling leaders is to really identify what are the beliefs and what are the actions that are limiting school counselors from this innovative ideology of fostering diversity rather than oppression for Black and Brown students? So if your self-reflection reveals surprises, it may reveal some pain or even a little hurt, then that's time to commit. That's when school counselor leaders commit to the action. School counselors leaders already maintain that interpersonal influence that's needed. They are able to systemically work with other stakeholders, to be present at school board meetings, to work and collaborate with community leaders. That school counseling anti-racist means it must be intentional. It's the only choice. It's the only option. And so when we have this self-reflection, it should just automatically lead to the examination of data. I think that's something that, Dr. Mays mentioned as well. When we begin to examine our school and district practices and policies through a data lens, what do we see in the culture of our school and our district? What are those data elements that promote college access and attainment for our Black and Brown students? When we really look at funding, how are we funding our allocations for students in equitable ways for all students, particularly our Black and Brown students? Who's teaching what classes? And when you dare to go in and look at the demographics of classes, what do you see? Where are the Black and Brown students in the honors classes? Where are they in the AP classes? Where are they in IB classes? So as a school counselor leader, if you authentically examine the data, the only next step is to develop a plan. So you say, this is easy. Yeah, as school counselor leaders, we know how to develop plans. We develop strategic plans. We develop closing the gap plans. But folks, this is an anti-racist plan. It is a plan that challenges and dismantles all of the racist beliefs and actions that currently exist within your district and within your schools. It is an intentionality to foster actionable plans to erase it, not to bridge the gap, but to erase all racism and all discriminatory practices within your schools and districts. So, your goal here is to create a culture and a climate that's really conducive to discuss race. That means to offer anti-racist training for school counselors, for your staff, for faculty, for parents, for students, school board members. I'm not talking about random acts of improvement with professional development or drive-by professional development. This is professional development that becomes the fabric of your school and of your district. We're talking about professional development that within your plan, you see it and it's integrated in your school counseling program's mission and vision statements, that it's a language that everyone speaks. It is the fabric of your school district. So in order for us to really embrace this progressive anti-racist school counseling leadership change that's really needed to dismantle our inequitable policies and procedures that impact our Black and our Brown students, that anti-racist plan should result in immediate implementation and immediate application. There should be this nurturing of these collaborative relationships with stakeholders at the table. Invite them to the school counseling table and you go to their table for these discussions about race. There should be an opportunity for a safe space to have the discussions. So think about an anti-racist school counseling environment, that it must be your vision through the integration of transformative and transformational, really authentic leadership actions as a school counselor leader. So always think of this, the change begins with the leader. So as a school counselor leader, we must continuously self-reflect, continuously examine the data, the formative and assessment data process. And from that, we are creating and refining an actionable anti-racist visionary plan for all of our Black and Brown students that we're working with. It becomes the fabric of your school and your school district. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Tracy Jackson.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. Powerful words have been spoken this afternoon. I know that we are running on time, so I'm going to try to make my points as quick as possible. I want to talk a little bit about school counselors and working with parents and how we can help parents and families with our anti-racist actions. So one of the first things to think about is how can you empower your families with how education works? We know that we have a lot of Brown and Black families that don't understand formal education in the sense that we understand it, being on the inside and working within it. So with that, there are ways that you can help your parents. Give them the exact verbiage. Give them the words that we use in our school system at our meetings, that the principal uses, so that they're able to combat any incidences of discrimination or of discourse, so that they can fight and learn how to advocate for their children and themselves. You want to teach parents how to challenge existing practices that don't make sense or that they feel are discriminatory. Okay, we know that a lot of times in our schools, practices are subjective. Some of the things that that teachers and administrators use to justify why they do certain things are not always embedded in data. And we know that as school counselors, that's what we're taught in our programs, right? To always look at the data, let the data speak and tell the story. So some of these practices have been mentioned earlier, but again, I'm going to probably cover a few of them that we can challenge for ourselves. We can challenge them with our administrators and our parents. We can help them. And these practices could be discipline. They could be attendance. They could be your grading practices or your homework practices. Again, we heard earlier about access to higher level courses, gifted programs, IB programs. What are those practices that create barriers or prevent all students from having access to them? When it comes to seating arrangements in class, inform the parent to ask where their child is sitting and who are they sitting near. I remember going to observe an elementary counselor give a lesson one time, and I walked into the classroom, and the classroom was divided into little quads, and they had probably about maybe about 6 quads, and I looked, and there was one quad that had the Black and brown students in it, and all of the remaining quads were their white counterparts, and it just hurt my heart to see blatantly that these students were being separated and sectioned off in this classroom. Also, you want to ask about any type of situation where we have programs that develop class leaders. So again, encourage your parents to ask, how are class leaders picked? Hall monitors, and are these and all other experiences, leadership experiences that happen in the classroom and in the school? How are these students selected? Are there affinity groups in the schools where you work? And if they're not, how can students create one? What's the process and the policy for creating affinity groups? We heard my esteemed colleagues talk about college and career readiness. So again, making sure that we as counselors understand the tradition and the homage of HBCUs and Hispanic serving institutions and scholarships that go along with that. And we don't dismiss them because we are not sure or we're not familiar with these institutions. So again, it's important to understand the history of why our Black and brown students may want to attend these colleges and the tradition that lives within them through their family and their culture. Something else that we can do as anti-racist school counselors is to look to your community. There are numerous Black and Latinx fraternities and sororities that need to partner. It's part of their programming that they give back to the communities in which their organizations have chapters. So look to these groups to come in and help as mentors. They can provide programming assistance. They can provide scholarships. They donate monies. So again, if you're not sure how to reach out to them, you can simply Google, African-American fraternity sororities, the same with the Latinx ones. And these individuals can come into your schools and they can do workshops for your parents. They can do workshops for your students. So again, a very important part of our community. One thing that we need to be cognizant about, and I see this time and time again, are the practices of our transfer students. When students are transferring from other school divisions, from school divisions that may have a reputation of not being as rigorous or being having heavy percentages of minority students. What are those practices? How are we transferring those credits for those students so that they have an equal opportunity to graduate on time without having the school system give them extra courses where they may not graduate on time, or they have to double up courses, or they have to go in the summer. So looking at your transfer credit policies and practices is very, very important for making sure that all our students have equity. And the last thing that I really want to remind school counselors is that to remember that the federal government gives the powers to the states, and then the states give it to the local school divisions. So your school divisions are creating the policies and the practices in which we have to implement and carry out. And we know that there are very conservative school divisions, there are more liberal school divisions. So I implore you to do the work, to know your community, know your culture, know your school board policy and regulations, because that is really going to help you be a catalyst for change. Because when you're armed with the knowledge and you see where it's written or it's not written, it makes it easier to challenge a lot of these practices that are already in existence, and how we can help our Black and Brown students, and how we can continue to be anti-racist school counselors. Dr. Harris, that's all I have at this time, so thank you so much.
Well, Dr. Jackson and team, thank you for all of your wise words today. We're going to transition now to some question and answers. And again, we'll get to as many as we can. I'm going to invite Dr. Holcombe McCoy and all of the panelists to join me on screen again. And I'm going to jump right to it. Dr. Holcombe McCoy, we're coming back to you. You talked a lot about it, and it ended up being a theme in many ways, and a lot of what we shared, the replacing achievement gap with opportunity. And so the question that came in specifically for you related to that is just, can you say a little bit more about that? What do you mean by opportunity?
Well, I mean, I think we've all talked about it, opportunities as far as the opportunity to participate in a gifted and talented program, to be identified as such, is an opportunity, is a privilege that many Black and Brown students don't get, even though very brilliant, smart, gifted, but not identified. I mean, the same is true with, as you were talking about, athletics and there are other extracurriculars that, that Black and Brown students are given this narrow pathway to success. I can only be an athlete. If I'm Black, being an athlete is the only way out for me, right? So the opportunity to explore other career options is never even given. I did a study years ago at the College Board, and we found out, for instance, that in urban schools with high minority, high numbers of students of color, the counselors were actually advising students, first generation college students, were all going to 5 universities or colleges. 5, only 5 were the option for the students in that school. And it wasn't the counselor's fault, except that, it was the opening of the minds of the counselors that these are students that can go many different places, not just to these 5 institutions, right? So that's not the lack of ability, that's the lack of opportunity. So if I could rename my book, it would not be Closing the Achievement Gap. Again, it would be Closing the Opportunity Gap. And that's where counselors come in, because we are the shepherds to opportunity, right? We open the doors for students. That's a powerful job on our part. We either close or open the door to opportunity. And so if I had to rename it, I would, and it has everything to do with, as you said, Paul, this deficit model that we often work from. And we don't realize it. And that's the intentionality piece, is that we have to be intentionally thoughtful about every move we make. If we really want to change and become anti-racist, that means every decision we make, we should be taking it through some process of questioning ourselves. What are we doing? Am I further perpetuating racialized outcomes by making this decision, or should I rethink this decision? I tell this story often, and I won't go into it, about a little boy. Anita knows this story well, because I used to tell it all the time, about a student I had in kindergarten who was thought to be a problem maker, but he was the most brilliant kid. And we opened up the opportunity for him to be in a gifted and talented program, not because others wanted it, only because I pushed it. And I asked the right questions at that time. And the principal said, yeah, let's do it. Opened it up, and the young man became, graduated from MIT later. So the opportunity to go on to graduate from a top university or to be pegged as a problem student. I mean, that's how life-changing the role of a school counselor is. I mean, it's life-changing. So, I just, propose that we stop thinking about children from this deficit way of thinking and start talking about the lack of opportunities and how our job is to open doors, not to shut them.
Now, a follow-up to that for you, Dr. Holcombe-McCoy, and then opening it up to anybody on the panel. I'm pulling some questions together here, and I think what's underlying it all is working with other leaders, other stakeholders, particularly when there may be resistance to this. Dr. Holcombe-McCoy, you've done that on so many levels, and I know others on the call have done so in their own ways. But can you speak to what recommendations you have for navigating the power structures, right, and the resistance that can come in so many different forms, from educational leaders and others to policy and change in practices?
So first of all, my bit of wisdom, because I am getting old, I have lots of gray hair now to show it. So making change doesn't come without the result of gray hair. So that's one thing you can look forward to. But I think it's courage, having the courage to stand up. And you don't need other people to do that. Just having the courage to ask questions to make others think around you, right? And the intentionality piece is so key. Also, I think it's important for school counselors to get to know other disciplines outside of our own. So, I started reading what principals read and how they're trained. I started using their language. I understand what superintendents and chancellors understand. I have a meeting later today, actually, with the chancellor of DCPS. So it's like, I read what is he interested in? So when I go in to meet with him, I want to talk his language and what he would want to see. He would then partner with me. I mean, we then become fast friends. So it is living outside of the world of being a counselor. It is, find out what others are doing. Learn, just like in good counseling, we learn to look through the eyes of others and understanding how, what's making them tick and what are some of their outcomes, and find those shared interests. I mean, I think that is really important. I talked about Black psychology before I started with that little short history slide. It's important for us to delve into the literature of these other disciplines, because there's so many cues and hints to how to do our job better by looking at what others are studying. I mean, Black psychologists have been studying, how to teach Black children for years. We should be looking at that in school counseling. I mean, there's a lot of hints for how we can do our work better. We should be thinking about leadership theories. Anita, I know her background in leadership. We should be looking at that literature to help guide our practice. And the same is true, it goes on and on. I mean, there's so many linkages with other disciplines. So we have to not be narrow, we have to be broad in our thought, and then bringing back all of those ideas back to our work. I think it's worked for me to help me to, overcome some of those barriers along the way.
So good. Any other examples on the panel to that general question, and maybe some other ways that you've seen it play out in your own experience?
Actually, Mike, I'm going to ask a question to Dr. Anita Young based on working with teachers, because I get this often. My role is not to evaluate, right, teachers, right? And so what advice would we give to future school counselors and school counselors when really trying to confront some of the racist practices in consultation with teachers, knowing that we're peers, right, and not an evaluator?
Yeah, that's a question that I often raise in my school counselor leadership course when working with teachers. What is the most effective consultation model to use? And how do you broach those conversations with them? Because the first response often is, well, you're not a teacher, you're not in my classroom. Acknowledge, yes, I may not be a teacher, or I may not have those teaching credentials. But once you come together, with what I call the resourceful problem solving. And it goes back to what Dr. Holcombe McCoy was saying, that we need to get in there and read the literature to be able to speak instructional language. So if they're using Cornell notes or Marzano strategies, we need to have knowledge, because part of that is that interpersonal influence of leadership, and it's the networking and being able to navigate throughout the system so that we're all there for the same vision and common good. But I think that's probably the most challenging encounter, especially with what I call horizontal school counselor leaders. Those are the first year school counselor leaders that think that, you know, I really do not have any leadership capacity. What can I say to a teacher? But we are trained. And I think as counselor educators, that really needs to be more of our curriculum so that we speak instructional language. I could not have said it better than Dr. Holcombe McCoy. We just have to, we know school counseling language, but we have to speak instructional language. I think that's the first key to breaking down barriers. It's really not consultation, but it's communication.
Yeah,
I wonder.
Oh, go ahead.
I just maybe thinking of evaluation on a larger scale. So it's interesting to me, right, that schools are very unique in how we understand evaluation. Evaluation is something that happens in the private sector, in business and all that. But when it happens in a school, we think that when we close the classroom door or we close the counseling door, that's my space and it's protected. So I think it also comes back to leadership and how leadership is engaging this idea of evaluation, and that it's actually really helpful. And then I think it creates an opportunity for us as school counselors to engage it and say, I'm a part of a feedback loop to help. I'm not coming in to tell you you are terrible at your position, but rather this ship gets better as we all are getting better. And so I want you to give me feedback too.
Exactly.
Tell you what, we have on the YouTube thread questions coming in and the Q&A thread here coming in. And as you might expect, there's never enough time. So here's what I'll say. The anti-racist SC hashtag, I didn't mention SC chat, that hashtag. I would encourage you, if you've not already visited that thread over the course of the past several weeks and months with all of the different webinars happening, and throw your question out there as well, and view some of the other webinars that have been put on by different groups. Dr. Holcombe McCoy spearheads a pretty critical one in our time at American University, and I hope you can find some fodder and some answers to those questions there as well. But I do want to honor your time as well as the panelists who have joined us. And so with that, don't leave us just yet, because we have an evaluation and some other thoughts related to recertification points that we want you to be aware of.
And Paul, hold it. I'm going to interrupt you because
yes, please do. You can
do that. I just want to say we all love you, Paul. Thank you so much for having us today. This has been tremendous. I just want to just show you all the respect. Thank you so much.
Oh, that means a lot from you.
All right. And it's all about love too, right? It's all about the love.
It's all about the love. And yes, and it's nice to feel that. So I appreciate it. And I'm not here without you. You know that, and everybody on this panel and those listening, all the folks who have influenced each other to make each other better. So thank you for those comments, Dr. Holcombe McCoy. And thank you for attending, those listening still, and for being here again. This work will continue because of you. Right? We've shared, but Dr. Holcombe McCoy, that last slide she had, what will you do with it? It's going to go on because you'll take it back to your corners of the world and you'll start having courage, like Dr. Holcombe McCoy just said, and doing perhaps what some others are not ready to do or have enough courage to do. That work will continue because you will, and you'll be able to lead in your districts, your universities, your communities, because it matters. It matters. Thank you to Kelly Bloom, our amazing events manager at the School of Education and Human Development. Thank you so much. Vicki Thomas, who organizes my and our program's life all year round, especially this event every year. Ellie Wengert, our master's student, who organized these questions for us and gave us an opportunity to discourse a bit. To Derek Williams, quietly but very powerfully leading our group of faculty in the counselor ed program at UVA, for your support, all of our colleagues in the program. Thank you. Year after year, you support And last, but certainly not least, Dr. Cheryl Holcombe McCoy, you're amazing. Thank you for the work you continue to do. It matters. It's making a difference. And I wish I had some gray hair to grow. So, but I appreciate your wisdom and your continued diligence in leading all of us. Dr. Aiva, Dr. Mays, Dr. Young, Dr. Jackson, thank you for who you are. In addition to all that you do every day for human beings. We wish you a safe, and I really mean that, a safe, peaceful week. And I'm going to drop in the chat an evaluation. I hope I put it there for everybody to see. I forgot to pass that along, so I'm going to do that myself there. But if you go to that evaluation, one, it's going to give us feedback about how to do this better. With each passing year, we hope that we improve, but also it'll allow us to send you, if you're interested, a certificate for recertification points, if that's something that you desire. Not everybody needs it, but if you do, we want to send that to you. Before I sign off, I always like to check in to see if Derek or anybody on the panel, Kelly, if there's any other administrative logistical items that I may have missed or that you wanted to just share before we head out. Eric?
Yeah, I'd just like to just echo, thank you all for coming. Thank you all for what you brought to us today. It's a lot to chew on for many of us, and we will chew, and we will make sure that we take what you say and use it in our practice, whether we're counselor educators, whether we're school counselors, whatever. I just hope that we all take the information that we've gained and do something with it. So thank you all, and I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Take care, all.